Okay, we're in Daniel chapter 9. We have been studying Daniel from one standpoint. We've been looking at some basic thoughts out of the book of Daniel, and we have seen that Daniel was able to foretell the future in great detail, especially concerning the four kingdoms, starting with Babylon in around 600, 550 BC, somewhere in there, going down especially to Antiochus Epiphanes around 165, 175, basic numbers, BC. And then, of course, Daniel would foretell of the coming church or the Lord's kingdom in the days of these kings. So he would point out there would be Babylon, there would be the Medo-Persian Empire, there would be the Grecian Empire with Alexander the Great. Daniel chapter 2, all of this is in there. And then last of all, there would be the Roman Empire. And during the days of these kings, the Roman Empire, there would be a spiritual kingdom set up, which would be able to overcome all the other kingdoms, which the church did in the first century. We saw a number of passages that would show that. We also took notice of one or two items besides that. But then we turned to Daniel chapter 8, the 2300 days of Antiochus Epiphanes. We spent a lot of time in Daniel chapter 11 concerning Antiochus Epiphanes, and then Daniel chapter 12. And I do think that Daniel chapter 12 is discussing the days of 165 BC, not the first century, not the end of the world. That puts us in Daniel chapter 9. In Daniel chapter 9, you will notice that he gives you the year that he would write and see his prophecy, and it would be the first year of Darius. Now, there's a bunch of Dariuses, and I'm not going to nail it down, but I would say this is basically in the 6th century BC, somewhere around anywhere between 520 and 538. It depends on which one of the Dariuses you're talking about and whether or not he's mixing the name with the Cyrus. But in verse 2, he says, I, Daniel, understood by the books the number of the years whereof the word of Jehovah came to Jeremiah the prophet for the accomplishing of the desolations of Jerusalem, even the 70 years. Now, right there, you might put in pencil, or in this case, you could even put in ink pen, Jeremiah 25:11 and verse 12. Jeremiah, 70 years earlier, predicted 70 years captivity by the children of Israel in Babylon. Now, Daniel is saying those 70 years are past. So that's the time frame that he's discussing in the text. Looking at verse 3. What you have in verse 3 is a confession by Daniel concerning the nation's sins, the national sins, Israel's transgressions. Put your finger on verse 3 and look at verse 20. Verse 20 is an outstanding pointing to what Daniel is saying in the text. I'm going to read it. Daniel 9:20. While I was speaking, praying, and confessing my sin and the sin of the people of Israel. While I was doing this, here's what occurred. Well, what was Daniel doing? He was confessing his sins and the sins of the nation of Israel. Stop right there. Go back to verse 3. And remember, he just told you that he's confessing the sins of the nation of Israel. So skipping to verse 4, and I prayed unto Jehovah my God and made confession and said, O Lord, the great dreadful God, who keepeth covenant, he is faithful to do what he said he's going to do, and loving kindness, he will manifest his loving kindness to those, in the context of what Daniel's talking about, those who are faithful unto him. Loving kindness with them that love him and keep his commandments. We have sinned. Okay, watch what happens now. Daniel just told you that I am talking about myself and the nation of Israel. He's not talking about America. He's not talking about Russia. He's not talking about South America. He's talking about the children of Israel, and he has in mind the 6th century BC, or 500, 600 BC. Now you're going to underline some pronouns, and those pronouns, if you do this, will help the verses to stand out to you. You're going to have the we, the us, and the our, O-U-R, our, a personal pronoun. So he says, we have sinned and dealt perversely and have done wickedly and have rebelled, even turning aside from thy precepts and from the ordinances. 6 times in that short verse, he said, we have sinned, we have dealt perversely, we have turned from thy law. Chapter 9, verse 6. Neither have we hearkened unto thy servants, the prophets, that spake in the name of our kings, our princes, our fathers, and to all the people of the land. Our. We didn't hear them. We didn't listen to them. And that's why he's now confessing their transgressions and the sins and the iniquities that they've engaged in. Verse 7. O Lord, righteousness belongeth unto thee, but unto us confession of faith, as at this day, to the men of Judah, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, unto all Israel that are near, that are far, throughout all the countries. And so when he says we, when Daniel says we, he's not simply talking about Jerusalem. He's not in Jerusalem. He's not simply talking about Judah. He's not in Judah. He's in Babylon, 600 miles away. But he includes Babylon and Egypt, Assyria, Judah, Jerusalem, and there weren't very many Israelites in Judah, in Jerusalem, but he includes all of them. We have sinned. Verse 8, continuing the idea of the confession of the transgressions. Now he switches to the word ours, and you'll see it. O Lord, to us belongeth confusion of faith, that's sin, and to our kings and to our princes and to our fathers, because we have sinned against thee. By the way, that's the 8th time. That's the 8th time he said in one form or another the sin against God. Verse 9. To the Lord our God belong mercies and forgiveness. Now stop just a second. It's vitally important to grasp this concept. The concept is this. Yes, Israel has sinned. And they have sinned against God. Dreadful, awesome, amazing, magnificent. Well, if you've sinned against God, what would happen if he were a regular king? He would come and destroy that land. But notice, with Jehovah, is forgiveness. I cannot emphasize that enough to you, because if I fail to underline, emphasize, make bold, capitalize, italicize, there is forgiveness with Jehovah, you miss the point that I'm trying to make. And I remember a young lady a number of years ago at Owasso missed the point that I was making when I was talking about Manasseh. Manasseh was a horrible king. Manasseh was so sinful. He sacrificed children to the idols. And we went through 10, 15 minutes of the sins that he had committed. And then we turned our attention to the fact that he had repented and God forgave him. And I remember the young lady walking out, and she said, Ron, that was a horrible lesson. It is so discouraging. And I thought, discouraging? We're transgressors against God, and God forgives us no matter how deep our sin is. And you call that discouraging? I didn't say it out loud to her. I was so shocked by the fact that she would assess made to forget Manasseh in such a way. So we emphasize, we italicize, we make bold the concept that there is forgiveness with God. There is mercy with God. When, how, and in what way? We continue on and we notice we have rebelled against him. That's the 9th time that Daniel has said something like that. Neither have we obeyed the voice of Jehovah our God. That's the 10th time he has made the confession to walk in his laws which he has set before us by his servants, by the prophets. I think that's another important issue to take note of. God does not speak to an individual and say, you dirty rotten rat, or you sweetheart. What God did was by the prophets, by words. He had a message under the prophets and they spoke to the people. Nehemiah 9 is an excellent comment on that. We're looking at verse 11. What you just heard was a confession of sin. Now turn your attention to the consequences of them remaining in sin. Here's what he said. Yea, all Israel, we've emphasized that more than once. All Israel transgressed thy law, even turning aside that they should not obey thy voice. Therefore, watch what the outcome is. Watch the results and the consequences of such disobedience. Therefore hath the curse been poured out upon us, and he hath confirmed his words, which he spake against us and against our judges that judged us, by bringing upon us a great evil, underline the word evil, look at it closely. The word evil doesn't always mean moral bad. It doesn't always mean spiritually bad. It means ill fortune, bad things occurring against you. There is war all around us. That's evil or ill fortune, bad fortune to those folks. That's sometimes the meaning of the word. That's the meaning of the word here. They got into war and they didn't win. Now I want you to see again that he says, therefore the curse has been poured out upon us by bringing upon us a great evil, verse 13, as it is written in the law of Moses. If you're thinking, well, if I don't keep the law of Moses, God's going to do the same thing to me. No. This is to the children of Israel. This is what was promised and said to them. Daniel now says, even as Moses wrote, if you become disobedient to God, Deuteronomy 27, Deuteronomy 28, Deuteronomy 29, and chapter 30, those 4 chapters, and I think David uses Leviticus 26, says the same thing, that if Israel becomes disobedient to God, then they will be cursed. And he goes through a number of issues, ill fortune, bad things that will occur to the children of Israel. This passage is telling them, look, you have sinned, we have sinned, therefore we're in captivity now. We lost the battle. But don't be surprised. God said that's exactly what was going to happen to us. Right now, I would like to be able to turn over to Deuteronomy 28, but as you notice, we've been going through this pretty quickly. All this evil has come upon us. Verse 14, therefore hath Jehovah watched over the ill fortune and brought it upon us, for Jehovah our God is righteous. He's right doing in all his work which he doeth, and we have not obeyed his voice. The reason that Daniel says that God is righteous in doing what he's doing is because they have been unrighteous in what they were doing. Verses 3 through 10, the confession. Verses 12 through 14, the consequences. Verses 15 through 19, a call for blessings. Daniel turns his attention from the sins that have been committed, and he calls upon God to bless Israel, bless the nation. Remember, this is the time frame of the 70 years. They're past. They are past. So since the 70 years are past, that's the prediction that Jeremiah pointed out, that they would be in captivity. Now, Daniel calls for God to bless them. Verse 15. And now, O Lord our God, thou hast brought thy people forth out of the land of Egypt with a mighty hand, thou hast gotten thee renown, as in this day we have sinned, we have done wickedly. O Lord, according to all thy righteousness, let thy anger and thy wrath, I pray thee, be turned away from thy city, Jerusalem. Indeed, no doubt, certainly, in the days of Daniel, Jerusalem was a set-apart city, was the city of God. Not today, not for the last 2,000 years. But what he just said in this particular text is, you brought us out of Egyptian bondage, you made us renowned, we have committed great transgression, we have become infamous, and now we ask, we pray, we call upon blessings of removing your anger and your wrath. Listen, when God gets mad at you, it's justified anger. Yeah, I refocused it. Thank you. Verse 17. I appreciate it, Kevin, by the way. I happened to notice it, and now I have figured out pretty well how to do it. As you saw, I'm able to focus it back in. Oh, okay. Thank you. Verse 17. Now, therefore, O our God, hearken unto the prayer of thy servant and to his supplications, and cause thy face to shine upon thy sanctuary that is desolate for the Lord's sake. So first of all, he said, let thine anger and thy wrath turn away. Secondly, he said, cause thy face to shine upon thy sanctuary, thy people, and the holy place. Verse 18. O my God, incline thine ear and hear, O thine ears, and behold our desolations. Pay close attention to where we are. We have been desolated. Hold your finger right there. We're coming back to it. That's in verse 17. Go back up to verse 2. Look at the last phrase. Jeremiah the prophet spoke of this. For the accomplishing of the desolations of Jerusalem, even 70 years. So you can see that Daniel knows the book of Jeremiah. Daniel knows the book of Moses. That was verse 18. My apologies to you. Behold our desolations in the city which is called by thy name, for we do not present our supplications before thee for our righteousness, but for thy great mercies. We're not here because we're righteous. We're not presenting this because we're righteous, said Daniel. We're presenting this because we know that thou art merciful. 19. O Lord, hear, O Lord, forgive. Hearken and do, defer not, for thine own sake, O my God, because thy city and thy people are called by thy name. Tremendous section of scripture. By the way, I'm trying to get to 9:24. Don't know that I'm going to make it. Chapter 9, verse 20 through 23 is a different section. This section is a section we're going to deal with next week, more so than this week. It goes along, and you might write this down. I'll probably repeat it, but Daniel 9, 20 through 23 goes with Daniel 10, verse 11, verse 19, and some other thoughts that we may deal with. Verse 20, chapter 9, 20. While I was speaking and praying and confessing and presenting my supplication, yea, while I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I have seen in the vision at the beginning, being caused to fly swiftly, touched me about that time of the evening oblation. Oblation would be sacrifices. And he instructed me. I saw him. He touched me. He instructed me. He talked to me and said, O Daniel, I am now come forth to give thee wisdom and understanding. At the beginning of thy supplications and the commandment gone forth, I am come to tell thee, I have come to tell thee, I am standing before you with these words, thou art greatly beloved. Thou art greatly beloved. You talk about a passage to me that stands out, and I've been talking about it for over 30 years. When I first saw it, and then you combine it with Job, which we're going to do, best man I've got. And when you combine it with Luke chapter 1, thou art greatly favored, as the angel would say unto Mary, you can see that time and again, God lets his people know, sometimes personally, one-on-one, face-to-face, he lets them know how he feels about them. And here with Daniel, such a righteous and good man, such a man that is head and shoulders above everybody else. God says, and you're going to see this more so in chapter 10, I stopped everything I was doing, and it was important, and I came to stand before you to tell you, God said he wanted you to know, thou art greatly beloved. Great, great passage. Now we're in chapter 9, verse 24. Chapter 9, verse 24 through verse 27 is a prediction of the coming of Jesus Christ, and it is a prediction that is 490 years in advance. Daniel is now predicting when the Messiah would begin preaching. And he predicts the Messiah will die as well. Before we go through the words that are written, I'm going to try to present a chart to you. So there may be a little, okay, this first chart will tell you the beginning of the prophecy, which we will read about in Daniel 9, 24, 25, 26, and so forth. And then he's going to give you 490 years, or 70 sevens, which is 490 years. You will also notice in this particular chart, there's a 69 weeks, and that takes you to the year. You can see it at the bottom to the right, the year AD 27. That's when the Messiah began preaching and teaching. That's what I think Daniel 9 is going to be giving us. You'll notice that there are 7 years, sevens. Again, the language may be a little bit off for you, but we're going to be reading what the language is here in just a moment. I wanted you to see this chart first. You'll notice that there are 3.5 in the midst of the last week, the last sevens, that the Messiah is cut off. Jesus preached for 3.5 years, and then they crucified him. And then he preached, his apostles preached under the apostle of the Jews mainly. And then the gospel was spread out to the Gentiles. You'll see what is meant by that in just a moment. There's one other part that is not emphasized in this particular video that we are going to emphasize. So I'm going to go to the second chart. David, is it showing yet? And you've got good audio? Okay. This second chart kind of breaks it up slightly different, but yet it's the same. You'll notice at the bottom on the left, the year 457, that's when the prophecy began. That's the beginning of the days of the prophecy. That's not when it was given. You'll see what I mean in a moment. You'll see what I mean in a moment. In 457 BC, 49 years later, 7 sevens, Israel would be rebuilt. And she was. You can read the book of Nehemiah and see most of what he's talking about in that. And then you have the year 27 AD. That would be the year 483 years, or 69 sevens. Boy, a lot of numbers. We'll show them to you here in just a second. If you want to take a picture, as Patty does, of the chart, that works out well. I'm going to show you one more chart. Here you have, in a little bit different graphic situation, here you have underneath the 77s broken up into the 7 sevens, the 62 sevens, and the 1 sevens. And then in the midst of the week, or sevens. If you'd like to take a shot of that, that would work. What you're going to do is you're going to start with a decree by Artaxerxes, the ruler of the world, Persians, Medes, and he's going to let the Jews go back and rebuild Jerusalem, the city and the walls, and a few other things like that. They had been given one decree already, but and they did a good job, but not good enough. Then you have the second part, which would be the coming of Jesus to begin preaching. And what you have is the picture showing Jesus being baptized, Matthew chapter 3. That's when he began his personal preaching. Now I'm going to take the chart off. We're going to look at the verses. What you can do right now, and I understand the confusion, I really do. What you can do right now is simply garner what the chart is saying. I'm going to go to the verses and help you see it, but I need you to memorize the chart. What you have are 7 sevens, 49. What you have are 62 sevens. That's 483, plus the other 49, 483. Then you have 1 sevens, which is 7 years. Someone says, it doesn't say years. No, it doesn't. Doesn't say years, doesn't say days, doesn't say months. However, you're going to see that the prophecy is probably talking about 7 sevens, or 70 sevens altogether, 490 years. Now, I've got to show you from Scripture what is meant, but I wanted you to see the breakup, and we'll go back to it if necessary, the chart, but I wanted you to see the breakup before we started so that you can mentally see it. Go ahead. Okay, you should be back in Daniel chapter 9, verse 24. Now, what we're going to do is see what Daniel actually said. And we're going to hold the chart in the back of our mind. Daniel 9:24, 70 weeks are determined. Now, you heard me say 70 sevens. I'm not going to go into it, but a number of the commentators will point out that a week is 7 days, and that you have in reality in the Hebrew sevens, not 70 weeks, but 70 sevens. Again, I'm not going to go into all of it because you're going to come out the same way anyway. So 70 weeks, 70 sevens, are decreed or determined upon thy people and upon the holy city To finish, I need you to put a 1. To finish the transgression, a 2. To make an end of sins, a 3. To make reconciliation for iniquity, a 4. And to bring an everlasting righteousness, a 5. To seal up the vision and prophecy, and a 6. And to anoint the most holy. So those are the 6 things that he just talked about. Now watch this. What's this? He just pointed out these 6 things that are going to occur, and he has encapsulated the events. He has summarized the events that he's now going to give a few details. Watch the details, verse 25. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to rebuild Jerusalem unto the Messiah shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. You have to put those two together. 7 and 62. 60 is the old way of saying 60. A lot of explanation there, isn't there? If you will write down 7 and 62, add those together, you got 69. Oh, brilliant, 69. Why did he break it down? I'll tell you in just a moment. The reason for the 69 weeks unto the Messiah, if you add, if you multiply, if you calculate 69 sevens, you come out with 483 years. And from the time of the going forth of the commandment, that's what he said. Here's from the time point that you calculated, from the going forth of the commandment unto the time of the Messiah will be 483 years. The commandment, Ezra chapter 7, the commandment went forth in 457 BC. Whenever you put the numbers together, 457, Jesus came on the scene in 27 and began to preach in 27 AD, as we call it now. You add those years together and you have 483 years. That is what Daniel is pointing out. But he broke it up, didn't he? He said 7s and 62 sevens. The first 7 is the time of the rebuilding of Jerusalem in that day from the going forth of the commandment. Nehemiah and Ezra began to try to rebuild Jerusalem in the 5th century BC. Nehemiah, the book of Nehemiah explains it to you. And they finished before that century was out, 408, 407. They had rebuilt the sanctuary. They had rebuilt the worship to God. They had rebuilt the wall. They had rebuilt the city. And they had rebuilt the officials back into the city of God. And that's a part of the prophecy. But the long range is 483 years, the coming of the Messiah. Now looking at verse 26, and after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off. After he begins to preach, doesn't tell you how long after. It just tells you he's going to die a violent death. It'll tell you in a moment, though. But not for himself and the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. He just predicted the destruction of the city, and he predicted the destruction of the temple. Though they would rebuild it in the 5th century BC, it would be destroyed. He does not tell you when. He just says after the Messiah. The end thereof shall be with a flood. That's a big one. And unto the end of war, desolations are determined. 27. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. 1 week. 1 sevens. Okay, now we have our 70 sevens. With this verse, we have now introduced our last 7. So the prophecy is divided up into 3 sections. Section number 1, 7 sevens. Section number 2 that you add to that is 62 sevens. Section number 3 that you add to all of that is 1 week or sevens. Now, in the midst of the week, it says, he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations, he shall make it desolate, even the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon desolation. There's a lot of words in there. The main thing that you're getting out of it is this, that in the midst of that last week, he's going to put a ceasing in the mind of God, a stopping of the sacrifices, because Christ is going to be sacrificed for sins. And no longer is God going to bless the giving of offerings for sin, the sacrifices for sin among the children of Israel. That's in the midst of the week. When he died on the cross of Calvary, 3.5 years after he started preaching, he died. The apostles went throughout the world and they began to preach, especially to the Jews. Later, however, and we read about it in Acts 8 and Acts 11, the gospel, by the command of God, spread out to the Gentiles. And so he confirmed his covenant with many in that last week, because he not only died in the midst of the week, but he preached unto Jew and Gentile within that time frame. I got a half a minute left. I need you to call attention to this. This passage does not tell you that in the 770s, within that time frame, that Jerusalem will be destroyed. It does tell you that after the Messiah dies, that the Jerusalem would be destroyed. Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. Its destruction, the destruction of Jerusalem, is predicted in this passage, but the time is suggested after the 77s, after the 490 years. Sometime after that, it would be destroyed.